What's the story? Probably the funniest thing that Ann and I exchange once in a while is the line from a movie. Some comedian, some funny guy says, "What is your deal?" Now that's kind of a derogatory way of saying it, or a way of saying, you're really weird. That's not where we're going. But what we're trying to do is say, what's the story? What's the story behind that? Oh, wow, I bet you there's a story behind that. You ever said that or heard somebody say, I bet you there's a story behind that, right? And so that's kind of where we're going with this whole thing. And so we're going to be looking at the word story. This word story we don't mean a fictional made up story. We're talking about history, historical narrative. We're talking about things that have actually happened in history. I joked with somebody recently in another environment. We were joking about something, and I said, well, what's the difference between Jesus? They said, what's the difference between Jesus and Pocahontas? And they said, well, Pocahontas actually lived in history. Was a real historical figure. And I was like, okay, just time out for a minute. There's actually more historical evidence for the existence of Jesus Christ than Pocahontas. So, for Caesar Augustus, actually, there's more historical evidence, literary evidence, the works. So let's just keep that straight. We're talking about story. We're not talking about made up fables. You know, when we say, well, here's the children's story Bible, we're not saying, oh, those are nice stories we made up, fables. No. We're saying these are actual stories that took place. So when I say the story of your life, or the story of your life, we're not talking about made up stories. We're talking about what actually you experienced in your life, the story of your life. So what's the story? We want to find out more about what's the story. Well, in the book called Epic, The Larger Story by John Eldredge, he suggests that life for most of us feels like a movie we've arrived to 40 minutes late. We find ourselves in the middle of a story that is sometimes wonderful, sometimes awful, but usually a confusing mixture of both, and we haven't a clue how to make sense of it all. See, no wonder we keep losing heart, he says. We need to know the rest of the story. Ours is a great story that began before the dawn of time, a story of adventure, risk, loss, heroism, and betrayal. Wow, what's the story? See, life, you'll notice, he says, is a story. Think about that for a moment. Life is a story. You know, life doesn't come to us like a math problem. Think about that. I know some of you love math. Good for you. We won't ever be on the same team, but good for you. That's awesome. No, I respect you. Don't get me wrong. I respect you. We need people who do math well. I'm just not one of them. So I'm happy to let other people do that well. But life, you'll notice, doesn't come to us like a math problem. It comes to us like a story does. Scene by scene, chapter by chapter, right? A year goes by like a chapter from a novel. Sometimes it seems like a tragedy, sometimes like a comedy. Most of it feels like a soap opera. No, right? Either way, it is a story through and through. Madeleine L'Engle of Wrinkle in Time and many other amazing stories said this: all of life is a story. Interesting. See, she reminds us that love affairs, layoffs, the collapse of empires, your day at school, your child's day at school, none of it makes sense without a story. Interesting. So this is helpful to know. When it comes to figuring things out in this life you're living, you do well to know the rest of the story. You ever heard that before? All of us over 60? No, I'm not quite there, but... And now you know the rest of the story. Paul Harvey, right? And now I think his son is taking over the business, or his grandson, or his great-grandson. I don't know.
I remember him.
Yeah, the rest of the story. Paul Harvey, page 1, no, page 2. The rest of the story. Isn't that great? So you see a headline, and you go, oh, okay. And he goes, no. This is what's behind the headline. Here's the rest. And you go, oh, I didn't know that. Oh, that sheds so much light. Oh, I get it now, right? Because Paul Harvey shared the rest of the story. So it's helpful to know that there's more to the story. So when it comes to figuring things out in life, you do best to know the rest of the story, because for most of us, life, like I said, feels like a movie. We arrive late, but good things happen, but also bad things happen, tough things happen, beautiful things, tragic things, right? What does it mean? Like, how do you make sense of the story? How do you make sense of all the things that have happened? Right? So we find ourselves in the middle of a story, right? And it's confusing. And we haven't a clue how to make sense of it. No wonder we keep losing heart. So the story is like this. You were born. You're born in the midst of a story that began before the dawn of time. Think about that. The story goes back farther than time and space, right? It's a story of adventure, of risk and loss, heroes and betrayal. A story where good is warring against evil, right? By the way, isn't that every story? Isn't that every movie? Have you ever been to a movie? It's like, I'm not sure who the protagonist is, and there's not really an antagonist. Oh, they just live a really nice life and don't have any problems. And you're like, worst movie ever. Why? Because a movie starts with a protagonist, and then there's a problem or an antagonist or somebody opposing what's happening with the protagonist, the good person, the person you're supposed to like and feel affinity towards. Something bad happens, and then there's an adventure overcoming that bad thing, right? And then there's somebody trying to block it, and then if it's a tragedy, they're overcome by that evil or that dark or difficult thing. If it's a comedy, then it's just a funny thing. And if it's a typical drama, then there's some kind of a happy ending or a satisfying ending or an ending that you say, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, boy, that feels good if it's a feel-good movie, depending on the ending. But it's a story, right? Stories are important. So think of all the stories you've ever heard and ever loved, right? They've been trying to tell you about the true epic ever since you were young. So here's something to think about. Every book you read, every story you hear, and every movie you watch is a human attempt to somehow get a piece of the bigger story. In other words, there's an epic, huge, big story that's outside of time and space, and we're a part of it. And so rather than evaluating all movies as, oh, that was a bad movie, or I didn't like it, or there was too much swearing, or there was not enough of this, or not enough of that, or too much of this, try just for a moment, think back to them and think, how are they universal? And that's actually what's really cool about dramas that involve people and relationships, is that there's some meaning to them. You think of Lord of the Rings, you think of The Hobbit as examples, you think of Narnia. You think, okay, they're fantasies, but what's happening there that speaks to something larger and more universal? There's always a ring, there's always something evil, and there's always us struggling with that evil thing. And there's us overcoming or not overcoming. There's people who gave in to the evil. There's people who overcame the evil. There's people who were victims of stuff around. See where I'm going with this? There's a plot. There's a story. There's good. There's evil. So these are all part of a story. There's always a story. If you look at these pictures on the screen there, so on the left, I wonder what those two people are about and what's happening there. You could probably make up a story. What about the person in the middle there? They're a little overwhelmed maybe, got too much baggage. Are they carrying somebody else's baggage? Maybe it's a metaphor. Maybe they're carrying their own baggage and they can't even find their way. Or maybe they don't have boundaries and they keep taking on everybody else's luggage. What's the story there? See, there's something behind there. What about the one on the right there? Wow. You can make up a whole story about that, eh? Is that grandpa? Is that a new friend? Is that an uncle? Is that dad? What's going on there? And what's the story they're reading? Is it Princess Bride? Is this? Next one. A couple of these are actually real stories. So the one on the left, what do you think is the story there? Anyone? There's a lady and a boy and then a man. What's happening there? What do you guess is the story there?
Father going off to war.
Father going off to war. World War II. Daddy. And mom's like, oh, don't interrupt Daddy. He's in line. He's marked. But Dad's like, no, I gotta say goodbye. Like, I'm about to cry right now, just thinking about the story. What? We just looked at a picture. It's just a picture. Woman, child, man. What's the big deal? You go, no, there's a story. Oh, Dan, there's so much more than that. There's a story here. Wow. One in the middle. A couple people retired maybe on an adventure. Wow, they've lived a full life and now they get to do some stuff together and they're healthy enough to enjoy it. What about the one on the right? Does anybody know the story on the right? Historical event. Sorry? Anybody know? It's American, sorry, Canadians, but.
Some of to school?
Sorry, someone going to school?
I think you had to do the segregation at one point.
Yeah, this is the first black child to be escorted in and out of a white school during desegregation in the 50s in the United States of America. And she had to be protected by federal agents or state military. Yeah. If you watch Forrest Gump, he appears in this picture as well in the movie part. That was kind of, but yeah, that's it. Do you think there's a story there? How did she feel about going into a white school? How did she feel about being bused? This is the busing, desegregation. I knew a guy in South Carolina, and a black friend of mine I work with, and I said, hey, what was it like? And he said, oh, I remember being on a bus getting bused to another school. That wasn't just a black school, it was a desegregation. And there were parents, white parents, rocking our school bus. And we thought it was gonna roll. Think there's a story there? Wow, that's a big story. It's like, you experienced that, yeah. I mean, we know it from the books, we know it from the news. I met a guy who was actually on a bus, and that was happening during that era, a little bit later for him. But wow, there's always a story. Hey, what about the larger story? See, John Eldredge says, this is the story in which you have found yourself. Here's how it got started. Oh, and here's how it went wrong. And here's what will happen next. And he says, you can discover the story. See, when we say, what's the story? There are a lot of people out there that say, look, there's no story. If you ask Richard Dawkins, or the particularly angry atheists, neo-atheists, we might call them, the current most popular atheists, would say, get over it. You weren't created, there's no purpose in life, you're gonna die, there'll be nothing afterwards, suck it up. That's for real. Like, that's the actual, lots of hope in there, right? There's a lot of reason now to have compassion for others, and to see my life as mattering, right? No, you were a mistake, you're a product of evolution, you're gonna die, there'll be nothing left, there's nothing after this, get over it and live your life. Not all atheists go down that road, but that would be Dawkins and his ilk, his crowd. So there's no story. There's nothing else happening, nothing before, nothing after. You're just chemicals and water, bone. You're mostly water, actually, chemically speaking, biologically speaking. So, but there is a larger story, and we want to live into it. See, if you walk into any large mall, museum, amusement park, university, or hospital, you'll typically meet at least at once a very large map, right? And the famous red star and the encouraging words, you are here. These maps are offered to visitors as a way to orient themselves to their situation, to get some perspective on things. This is the big picture. This is where you are in that picture. Hopefully now you know where to go. You have your bearings. Oh, there's a big picture. There's a big mall, there's 800 stores, 3 of each kind at West Edmonds Mall, in different places, but you're right here so that you can find yourself, oh, I'm there, oh, I need to go here or there, but now I know where, I have my bearings, I know where I am. You and I need more than just, you're a mistake and you're gonna die and you're just in a no man's land. No, we wanna know, we need to know where we are in a larger story. There is a larger story, and we have a place, we have a role, okay? Wouldn't it be great if we had some help in that department? Finding out what the larger story was, and then finding out what your place. Wouldn't it be nice if there was a map that said, you're here? Good news, you came to the right place. See, this is the story in which you have found yourself. Here's where it started, went wrong, here's what will happen next, this is the role you've been given. If you want to fulfill your destiny, this is what you must do. Wouldn't it be good to know that? These are your cues, and here's how things are going to turn out in the end. You can discover that story, the story, maybe not with perfect clarity, maybe not in the detail that we would like, but in greater clarity than most of us now have. Like, God's not going to show up and say, you should go to this college, or you should take that class, or on this day you should wear such and such a thing. That's not how he works, but you can get some more clarity than most of us live with. You can discover the story. So we're going to be looking at the Gospel of John. So I'm going to encourage you. We read John 1:1-18 earlier. I'm going to encourage you every week for the next couple of months, read a chapter in the book of John. We're going to be in John 1, 2, and 3 the next few weeks. Today, John 1, the first half of it. Next week, a bit of John. The second half of John 1. And then we'll keep going on through the Gospel of John. And we're looking for stories. Facts are important, but we're looking for the stories. We're looking for the people. So stories from the Gospel of John include a religious guy who just didn't get it. If you grew up in church, you might know who that guy is. A sex trade worker. A guy who died before his time. A person possessed by demons. And then the best and worst friend ever. You're probably thinking of two different people there. Possibly. All of these people are real people with real stories in the Gospel of John with whom Jesus interacted. So often in John, we call this a book of discourses, or it's the Gospel, the story of Jesus that includes the conversations that Jesus had with various people, or discourses we call them, okay? So conversations. Very important in the Gospel of John to know how he related to those people, how they related to him. In other words, we can say, well, what's their story? What's the story there? There's got to be a story here. And I encourage you, wherever you land on how comfortable you feel about things like the Chosen TV series, what it does is it gives you a window into the stories. They're fictionalized stories. Like they come up with things in stories that aren't in the Bible necessarily. They embellish like a movie often does. So don't take it as this is exactly what the Bible says, but use it as a way to say, oh, this is a story. Oh, these people have a backstory. Oh, there's an origin story. Oh, we didn't know. We hadn't really thought about John or Peter's or Thaddeus's origin story, their backstory. So that's what that particular program does. It helps you understand some of that. But as we do that, we're going to be looking at three particular themes. The first is others have a story. The second is God has a story. The third is you have a story. Straightforward? Well, others have a story, meaning, or the application of that is, we need to learn to listen well. If someone else has a story, we need to begin by saying, oh, could you please tell me your story? See, I have another favorite way of doing it, okay? And maybe you do too. No, it's probably just me. If I see somebody grumpy, you know what I look at? I say, oh, they're a grumpy person and they hate everybody around them. See, you know what I do? I make up a story about other people. You don't do this, but I do. It's called judging. It's called writing our own story about people. Do you like it when other people write a story about you? I was at school the other day and somebody said, oh, that new kid, really mean. I said, you met the new kid? No. Have you talked to the new kid? No. You know her name? No. She has a mean face. And I talked to her and she didn't say anything back to me. I'm like, so she's a mean person. What were you like when you got to school here in the first few months? Well, I kind of just did stuff on myself. See? You're probably an axe murderer. Yeah, you probably killed people before coming to the school, see? Because, you didn't talk to anybody. So we tell ourselves stories about other people. And I'm challenging us to ask someone to tell us their story, their understanding of their journey, what they want you to know about them. And will it be the whole story? No. But it'll be their story. Okay? Second, God has a story. And I want to encourage you to learn to invite others into it well. First of all, know his story well. Second of all, learn to invite others into it well. Do you think God wants everybody to be in his story? Yeah, I think he does. Matter of fact, Jesus said, I want everybody to be at my banquet table, eating the best food, celebrating the most that they can, enjoying abundant life. He said that in John 10, the abundant life. And then elsewhere he said, go to the highways and byways and just find anybody you can lying on the ground, behind the bushes, in the gutter, Invite everybody. Just get them in the house to experience what I have for them. The table has to be full. He wants every individual on the planet in all of history to be at his table. Invite them into my story, is what he's saying. Thirdly, we have a story, or you have a story. Learn to share it well. Now, we're going to be getting this in the coming weeks. There's a really bad way to tell your story, and then there's a better way to tell your story. And we'll be getting into that. You can imagine some really bad ways to tell your story. I'll give one. I grew up in a Christian home, and I'm really a perfect person, and you're not, so you're going to hell. First of all, it's not a story. Second of all, it's not true. I'm not a good person. Third, that's a set of facts, that all of which may be even in question. So throwing a bunch of stuff out there is just facts. Telling your story is telling your story. We're going to have one of those a little bit later on in the service on video. And I've invited some of you to be a part of interviewing you just to hear a little bit of your story. And you're going to tell the story the way you understand it, your own story, and whatever you want to share with us, okay? Because we need to hear each other's stories. Before the service, I asked you to find somebody you didn't know, maybe two, be gutsy, ask their name, and find out something about them. My guess is some of you found out, A, other people's names, B, you might have found out one fact about them, one interesting thing, right? That was the beginning of saying, tell me your story. Well, you have a name? Do you know someone here? We try to keep this place a secret, so how did you find us here? That kind of thing, just find out. All right? So other people have, you have a story, learn to share it well. And by the way, learning to share a story, in 1 Peter we're told, be ready to give an answer for anyone who asks for the hope that you have. So what does giving an answer imply? That someone asked you a question. So telling your story is usually in response to an invitation where someone asks you to tell them your story. Until they ask you to tell them your story, it may be premature to tell them your story. So even timing matters in telling our story. So sharing it well involves what we share, how we share it, when we share it. We'll talk more about that. So, quickly to illustrate story. This is amazing, right? Look at this. Nordegg Biking Large Bear. Isn't that amazing? Listen to this. Nordegg Biking Large Bear. Kids going, what are you talking about, Mrs. G? Yeah, that's really exciting, isn't it? Okay, how about this one? You'll get this one, right? Christopher Columbus, Spain, August 3, 1492. Let's give it up! Woo! 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 Yeah, it doesn't kind of doesn't work for you, especially if you're didn't take American history and you're over 50 or 60 or under 50 or 60. You're like, yeah, whatever. So the kid's going, not that amazing, right? Well, it's kind of like this. You probably heard this one. A man is sent to prison for the first time. First night there. After the lights in the cell block are turned off, he immediately sees his cellmate going over to the bars and yelling, 12! The whole cell block breaks out laughing. A few minutes later, somebody else in the cell block yells, 4! Again, the whole cell block just breaks out laughing. Why are you guys just yelling numbers, he says to his cellmate. What's so funny about random numbers? Well, says the older prisoner, they're not random. It's just that we've all been in here, in this here prison for so long, we all know all the same jokes. So after a while, we just started giving them numbers, and yelling those numbers is enough to remind us of the joke instead of telling it. So wanting to fit in, the new prisoner walked up to the bars and said, 6! But instead of laughter, a dead silence fell on the cell block. He turned to the older prisoner. What's wrong? Why didn't I get any laughs? Cellmate says, well, you didn't tell it right. So, how we tell the story really matters. What we tell in the story really matters. So let's go back to Nordegg Biking Large Bear. So, my son and I were downhill biking Nordegg above it, called 12th level or one of the different downhill mountain biking. That's when I was younger and had more guts or stupidity. Going downhill mountain biking. So we're going down, flying down this thing, crazy stuff. Like kind of where you have to get your bum way back behind the seat and lean way down so you don't go over the bars. OTB, in case you don't know what that is. Anyways, so we're going down, and all of a sudden, we're in a line of 14 downhill bikers. All of a sudden, I'm third from the back. The line just slams to a stop. We're like, ah! You know, like ride it, don't slide it. In this case, we're all sliding to a stop. And we're like, whoa, what's going on? And the guy at the front says, I just about hit a grizzly. Like literally, he says, I slammed on my brakes, the back wheel came up, I almost went OTB onto the grizzly. And there had been a black bear on the same trail the day before. After this, they canceled the downhill biking race that was going to happen the next day on that route for obvious reasons. So I'm third from the back. The guy two back from me says, hey, keep moving. I'm like, what? Bear! So the bear got out of the way, the bikes crashed, stopped without hitting each other somehow. The bear is still here, but in the bushes, and is looking at the last three of us in the line. And we can't go forward because of the 11 in front of us. Like, get moving! Great, you stopped, you play on the bear. Now get going! So we're like pedaling like crazy because it was literally looking and making noises at the guy, me and the guys before. I didn't actually see it. The guys behind me, so it's still there! So was that a better story than Nordegg biking large bear? Okay. Well, that's the rest of the story. The other one would be Christopher Columbus, Spain, August 3rd, 1492. I won't go into that. It's a boring story. They end up in the wrong place, starting calling people Indians because they thought they were in India. No, they're in the Bahamas. Anyways, something about America and discovery and gold and slavery and colonization and everything else. So let's just avoid that story. Well, what's the difference between facts and stories? Well, facts are dots on paper, right? Stories are a Claude Monet oil on canvas. Hey, how about that? Facts are like a signed contract versus a fulfilling lifetime career as an engineer or an artist or a musician. Facts are like a transaction, like buying a car, versus a story, which is like a loving lifetime relationship. Facts are like a ticket or itinerary versus stories, which are like going on an expedition or an adventure. Facts are like a photo of the Grand Canyon, woohoo, versus summiting Mount Everest. Wow. See, when it comes to our faith and the journey of our faith, it is a journey, and we're in a story that will someday become an even greater adventure. It's a journey with more adventure ahead, the kind that C.S. Lewis wrote about in The Last Battle. You remember this? It's the last paragraph in The Last Battle of the Narnia series. Who's read the Narnia series? And up to the last battle, even, it's hard to make it all the way through, but yeah, awesome. And so here they are at the end, and this is what he writes. All their life in this world and all their adventures had only been the cover and the title page. Now at last they were beginning chapter 1 of the great story, which no one on earth has read, which goes on forever, in which every chapter is better than the one before. By the way, if your view of heaven is anything less than this, I was going to say don't sign up because it sounds really boring, but this version here is like a new heaven and a new earth version. This is the Jesus version, okay? It's a story that's going to be, every chapter will be better than the last. It's going to be amazing. So in John chapter 1, we'll learn a bit about, I was going to say Jesus' origin story, but it's not, is it? John 1:1 is Jesus' background story, because Jesus doesn't have an origin story. Did you get that? So in the beginning, the Word already existed. The Word was with God. The Word was God. He existed in the beginning with God. God created everything through him, and nothing was created except through him. The Word gave life to everything that was created, and his light brought light to everyone. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness can never extinguish it. And then in verse 10, he came into the very world he created, but the world didn't recognize him. He came to his own people, and they even rejected him. But to all who believed him and accepted him, he gave the right to become children of God. Verse 13 and 14. These people who accepted him are reborn, not with a physical birth resulting from human passion or plan, but a birth that comes from God. So the Word became flesh and made his home among us. Eugene Peterson says, became flesh and moved into the neighborhood. Isn't that good? Moved into the neighborhood. I love it. He was full of unfailing love and faithfulness, and we have seen his glory, the glory of the Father's one and only. Isn't that amazing? This is a story. This is a story that we can get a bigger picture of. But John 1 is actually part of a bigger story. An even bigger story. We're going to watch a short video that looks at the story of the Bible. Let's run it. And maybe kill a couple of likes here.
The Bible's an important book, but it's really long.
Yeah, it's a collection of many books written over a long period of time, but altogether they tell one unified story.
So, what's the story of the Bible?
Well, it begins by introducing us to a beautiful mind, the author of all reality, a being called God. And he has the power to take the dark chaos of the uncreated world and bring about order and beauty and a garden full of life.
And to crown this accomplishment, God appoints these creatures called humanity,
Or in Hebrew, Adam,
and they're made as God's image.
which means that they're commissioned to rule this beautiful world on God's behalf by harnessing all of its potential and creating even more beauty and order.
This is a story about humans using their power to do meaningful, life-giving work. But the question is, how?
Yeah, humanity now faces a choice that's represented by a fruit tree. So humans could partner with God and find freedom by trusting in his knowledge of good and evil.
Or
They could seize power and define good and evil on their own, which, God warns, will kill them.
and they hear the voice of a dark, mysterious creature that tells them the choice is simple. Take the fruit. It'll give you power and freedom to rule the world on your own terms.
And so they seize this knowledge, and as a result, they become suspicious and self-protective. It leads to fractured relationships, violent power grabs, and ultimately, a whole civilization, Babylon, that has redefined evil as good. And so, God scatters this corrupted human project.
And here the story of the Bible takes an important turn. We zoom into the story of a man and a woman who come out of Babylon, Abraham and Sarah.
Yeah, God promises that from them will come a new people, a nation that has another chance to make the right choice. And if they succeed, it will open up this new way forward for the rest of humanity.
And this is why the rest of the Bible story is about this family.
And it does not go well. Despite God's personal guidance, Abraham's family gives in to that same temptation to redefine good and evil on their own terms, apart from God.
Even when their best people were in charge, rulers who loved God's guidance and had divine wisdom, even they gave in.
And so Israel was warned by their own prophets that these choices would lead them back to Babylon, this time as conquered captives living in exile, and that's exactly what happened.
So even with God's personal guidance, Israel fails. Who can succeed?
Well, the prophet said that the story wasn't over. God's going to send a new leader to Israel to cover for their failures and to transform the people's hearts and minds so that they can make the right choice.
And so the part of the Bible called the Old Testament ends, and these promises are left hanging.
And then the biblical story continues into the New Testament. We're introduced to a man who comes from the line of Israel's kings, Jesus of Nazareth. And he said that he was bringing all these promises to their completion.
He confronted that dark, mysterious evil that all humanity is given into and resisted its power.
And then he announced that God had arrived to rule the world through himself. Jesus taught about God's definition of good and evil, and he said that real power is serving others. According to Jesus, it's people who love the poor and even love their enemies. These are the kinds of people who actually rule the world.
And that's confusing, but also really beautiful.
And so is the claim that the story goes on to make about Jesus, that he is God become human, to be for Israel and for all humanity what we could never be for ourselves. He came to take the consequences of our evil into himself, and his sacrificial love proved more powerful than evil and even death itself.
So now humanity's presented with a new choice.
Represented by a new tree.
Stick with the old way of being human, or venture into this new way.
And in the story, those who choose the way of Jesus find themselves energized by God's own power. People who know that they are loved and forgiven by God can become people who love and forgive others in return.
The Jesus movement quickly spread throughout the world, forming these new communities of people who follow the way of Jesus.
But they face problems. There was persecution from the outside by people in power, and inside there was confusion, even compromise.
Yeah, because following Jesus is really hard.
And so the movement's leaders, called apostles, they wrote letters to comfort and to challenge these communities to stay faithful to the difficult way of Jesus.
And they're called to hope for the day when Jesus will come and change everything.
And so the Bible ends by pointing to the future day, when all wrongs are made right, when evil is eradicated, heaven and earth are united, and humanity can rule the world together in the love and power of God.
Okay, so that's the story of the Bible. And it brings all of these books together.
But what's interesting is that each book contains a different kind of literature that contributes to this story in a unique way. And that's what the next video will begin to explore.
By the way, it's estimated that 70, 75, 80% of the Bible is narrative or story. There are different genres in the Bible. Poetry, narrative, prophecy, but narrative is a big part of it. In other words, telling the story as we've just heard it here. So we have a place in this larger story. And remember that others have a story, God has a story, you have a story, we have a story. We're going to listen now to one person's story of having their story heard and placed within the larger story as we close our time together before communion. Rosaria Butterfield is her name.
We live at this time where so many Christian ideas are understood as hate speech. After the Obergefell decision legalized gay marriage, that put the gospel on a collision course with the new law of the land. And I think many Christians have been struggling with, well, how do I speak? What do I do? How do I move forward? Home is a vital place to invite your neighbors in, to have some heartfelt conversations. We can love our children together. We can let some things slide, even though the world we live in would say that we're supposed to be enemies. To me, hospitality is the ground zero of the Christian faith. I was raised in an Italian family. There were some issues in my house that made it almost impossible to have people in. So hospitality didn't really become endemic to my life until I had set up a home of my own. I was a professor at Syracuse. I lived as an out lesbian feminist in New York. In our LGBTQ community, somebody's home was open every night of the week. And there was never a question, where will I go if I need help? Because the community itself is organic and fluid, and that was how we dealt with crises. After I wrote my tenure book, I really wanted to write a book that was on my heart. Why is the religious right such a hateful community? And why do they hate people like me? I was on a war against two things, patriarchy and stupid. So I was really curious to know why relatively decent people would use the Bible in such a hateful way. So I wrote an editorial, and it brought all kinds of attention my way, which I didn't really expect. But one of the things it brought my way was a letter from Ken Smith, the pastor of the Syracuse Reformed Presbyterian Church. When Ken and his wife Floyd invited me to dinner, I was happy. I thought of Ken as my unpaid research assistant. And they were fine with the fact that I wanted to read the Bible to critique it. That began a research journey that changed my life. But it wasn't research that changed my life. In Ken and Floyd's home, the way that they practiced hospitality became a living, breathing example of the theology that they were teaching. After my first dinner at Ken and Floyd's house, Ken gave me a big hug, Floyd gave me a big hug and a kiss on the cheek. We said, we'll catch up next week. This was fun, can't wait to do it again. They did not share the gospel with me, and they did not invite me to church. And that was so wonderful. Because what it showed to me was that they didn't see me as a project. They actually saw me as a neighbor. You know, I didn't step foot in the church for 2 years, but every week I was in their home. And every week it was clear that pretty much anything could go. We could ask anything, Ken and Floyd were fine. And that process of dialogue and table fellowship was compelling. It was deeply compelling. I did not come to faith because I stopped feeling like a lesbian. It's not that I got all of my worldview issues just completely cemented with a happy Christian evangelism. Not at all. I came to faith because I became convicted that Jesus is who he says he is. Ephesians 4:29 is our watchword, that we are to impart grace to the hearer. I might not agree with everything that you hold to be near and dear, but because we are neighbors, I don't have to say everything that's on my heart. And you don't have to say everything that's on your heart right now. We can put some of our worldview issues aside. And over years of this, the gospel takes on a momentum that is compelling to people. I think we need to give each other the reminder that it's God who saves. It's not about certainly us being perfect or our words being perfect, but show up we must in the lives of unbelievers. What comes naturally to me and what comes naturally to you is to hang out with people who are like us, people who can maybe finish our sentences, people who don't scare us. But hospitality, biblically speaking, takes strangers and makes them neighbors, and takes neighbors and makes them family of God. It's a great joy to see the gospel bring people together who are supposed to be enemies, and it's a great joy to know that God never gets the address wrong. And if your neighbors aren't people you know yet, there's a blessing waiting for you.
Rosaria's husband is a pastor of a church, and she's a pastor's wife now. But it all started with an invitation to listen to someone's story by saying, "Tell me more." "I'm Rosaria. You wrote that letter to the editor. Tell us more about that. Why don't we have a meal together?" Wow. And then listening carefully to understand and demonstrate empathy. So this week, I challenge you to listen and look for stories that move you to understanding and to empathy around you. Who needs to be heard? Who needs to be understood? And where do you need to extend empathy and compassion? Second, ask, I wonder what their story is. And the way to do that is to say, tell me your story. I don't care what Facebook says about you. You don't have to say that. I don't care what my neighbor said. I don't care what the rumor is. Would you tell me your story? Third, ask, what is God's big story? Do I really understand God's big story? Do I believe it's a story or just a set of facts? And then where do I fit into it? And how can I learn to tell God's story well? Another thing you can ask this week is, what's my story? And what parts of it might be helpful for others to hear when they invite me to tell it? What parts of your story might be helpful in the moment? Not all of your story is helpful to everybody all the time. Parts of it may be. And when they're ready to hear it, or when they ask you to share it,